So today's lecture is going to cover some case studies of Imperial Rule and just some areas where these different styles that we learned from 6.1 are going to be practiced. So the first area we're going to study is the British Raj, which is over in India, and this is a classic example of indirect rule. Indirect rule was practiced in India through a system where the viceroy and the local rulers kind of worked together. So the viceroy was a British official who was appointed by the Queen to India, and they kind of think of him like as the governor of India. The viceroy would then make the laws for India and how to govern the country, which would then be sent down to the local rulers who were Indian princes, who would then carry out those laws for the viceroy. This allowed the Indian rulers to keep their titles and police their own people, but the British to really be the ones calling the shots in India. India was called the crown jewel of the British Empire, mostly because it provided the things that Britain needed to survive, and it was their most populated and most profitable colony. Britain, as an island, couldn't provide everything that it needed by itself, so the raw materials from India, like cotton, gold, foodstuffs, were critical to keeping the British economy going. Furthermore, because there were 300 million Indians, there were a lot of markets there for British goods. India didn't have a very large industrial base itself, so the British could create manufactured goods, ship them to India, and sell them there to make money. The third thing that's kind of new is the manpower that India provided. India had so many people that they could be used for soldiers in the British Army. We're going to see in World War I and World War II, Indian troops make up a large portion of the British Army fighting in a lot of various fronts around the planet, and it allows Britain to kind of expand its power beyond just the small population, well, relatively small population it has in Great Britain itself. How Britain came to control India is a very complex, long story that I've tried to kind of boil down here. But it starts with the British East India Company. And the British East India Company is a company that is chartered by the King and Queen of Britain to try and boost trade with India. And they gradually got more and more control over India. They began to negotiate with a lot of the native Indian princes. There was no like official Indian kingdom. It was a bunch of different little kingdoms all over the place. And they began to raise taxes, they began to provide security and gain more and more power in India. They eventually began to acquire trading posts. And this isn't just like get a small area. They began to acquire whole cities that were ran by the British East India Company. This is like Amazon owning Seattle and running it as their own little private area. It all changes, though, during the Sepoy Rebellion. So the Sepoys are Indian soldiers employed by the British East India Company. And the Muslim and Hindu soldiers in the British East India Company rebel against the British because the British were not very sensitive to the culture of the Indians, and they began to grease the bullets of the guns in pig fat and cow fat. And as you know, Muslims can't eat pigs, Hindus do not eat cows, so there was a cultural problem there, and a rebellion started. The rebellion is defeated, but this kind of proves to the British Queen that the East India Company is not ruling India that much. So the key part of this is the crown. So the British Queen takes direct control over India now. And this is the period that we then call the British Raj that lasts for about 100 years. This is that indirect rule period where the viceroy and the top officials, the generals, they're all British, and the lower officials are all Indian, and they actually run the country. This allows about 10,000 British to rule over 300 million Indians for over 100 years. They employ like a divide and conquer kind of strategy where they divide up the area by organizing the army along different tribes. They make individual treaties with different rulers to kind of make it so the Indians can't unite against the British. They also offer British education to the upper class of Indians, the native Indians, in hopes that they will become the future leaders of the Raj and will be loyal to Britain because they were educated by the British. This is going to backfire because guys like Gandhi are going to get their education, and instead of being loyal to the British, they're going to ask the British to leave so that India can set up a modern government. So based on your knowledge of the different styles of rule and what we just learned about India, kind of answer this question to yourself: why is the Raj an example of indirect rule? Our next style of rule is direct rule, and we're going to switch over from Britain and we're going to look at the French, and it's going to be specifically the French in Algeria. In direct rule, the colonized nation is administered directly by the colonizer. So they're really taken over, and that should say colonizer, not colonized. I'll correct that. The local rulers are completely replaced, and the colonizer's culture is pushed on the colony. So they are literally trying to turn their colony into the mother country. Algeria is kind of the poster child for this, and it's France's style of colonization. France had a ton of issues during the 1830s and 40s and had lost a bunch of power and prestige all over the world. So taking Algeria, which is right across the Mediterranean in Africa from France, was kind of seen as like a way to prove that France was still strong, and it was just a target of opportunity for the French. The French used a minor dispute to declare war, and they quickly defeated the Algerians and the Ottoman armies that were there and took the area over. They said that what they were doing was they were civilizing Algeria, so they're going to impose French culture on Algeria and try and turn Algeria French. They're saying that they're civilizing the area. So the education system was totally overhauled by the French, and if you became an educated Algerian who learned French and kind of adopted the French culture, you were given citizenship as a French person. You can see here that they're trying to turn Algeria into France. It became an actual department in the French government, which is like kind of like a state. It became a state of France. So they didn't even consider it a colony. It was part of France. But it's still used, and the colony is used as a way to make money for France. So exports from Algeria are all sent to France. They don't have a lot of industry, so France can sell things to them, and they encourage French citizens to go to Algeria to try and colonize the area with French people from France. So again, kind of think about this based on what you know about indirect rule. Why is that French Algeria an example of indirect rule? And if you can answer that, then I'm going to say that you understand indirect rule. The next style of rule we had was protectorate, and this is going to be Egypt and the British. So remembering back to a protectorate is where the nation is still technically independent. The local leader is still in power, but the protectorate is expected to listen to its imperialist nation's advice. And if they don't, there's usually some military or economic threat. The reason for protectorates is they are very, very cheap. It's easy to have a protectorate compared to actually having a colony because the protectorate still rules itself and completely runs itself. Egypt is kind of one of the keys to the British Empire, and that is because it is the gateway to India. You can see that you can go through the Mediterranean here out into the Red Sea, and if you keep going down, you'll end up in the Indian Ocean. You can easily get to India. Egypt was nominally controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but this guy, Muhammad Ali, rises to power, and he wants to modernize Egypt, which is a really good idea. He sees that colonization is happening all over the world, and there's going to be a lot of problems, so he wants to modernize Egypt to protect it. And his whole kind of grand scheme is to build the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal is right here. It's where the red line is, and it cuts the travel times to India drastically down. So if he has that, he's going to control a lot of the trade to India. The problem with building the Suez Canal is it put Egypt into debt. Egypt couldn't afford to finish the canal, so they sold their shares of the canal to Britain. And this is a major mistake because now the British have a huge interest in Egypt. There's a revolution against Muhammad Ali, and the British see that the canal is threatened, so their access to India is threatened, and the British decide to invade Egypt to protect their business interests there. They say they're just protecting their interest and their investments in the canal, and it turns Egypt into a protectorate. This leaves Egypt technically independent, but Britain controls what Egypt does because it wants to protect the Suez Canal. So as long as the Egyptians don't do anything to threaten Britain's access and control of the Suez Canal, the Egyptians can rule themselves. So they have to listen to the British and their ideas and their advice. Our last piece is a sphere of influence, and this is the great game that happens over in Persia. So a sphere of influence, if you remember back, is where two colonizers say that they have an area of interest. They don't actually control the area. They usually don't have control, but they say it's their area of interest, and the goal is to keep other nations away. So if you look here, the Great Game was fought over what we call modern day Afghanistan, and it is surrounded by a large amount of very powerful empires. Persia's kind of falling apart at this point, but still powerful. Obviously, Russia, very powerful British India, and the Qing dynasty over in China. And the British want to keep Imperial Russia away from India, and Imperial Russia wants to keep the British away from their homeland. So they both want to control Afghanistan as kind of like a buffer between their two states. Britain always wants to open up trade routes everywhere. So their goal in the Great Game is they want to control Afghanistan either directly or indirectly so that they can trade in the area and make more money. Russia wants to end the slave trade that was coming out of Afghanistan. There were Afghan raiders who would ride up into Russia, kidnap Russian citizens, and then sell them in the Ottoman Empire. And again, they also want to trade in the area. So at the Anglo-Russian Convention, the agreement is to split Persia and Afghanistan. There will be an independent Persia in the center, which will act as a buffer between Russia and the British. The British would get the south, so it keeps the Russians away from India, and the Russians would get the north so that they can keep the British away from their homeland. As you might have guessed, the Persians were not invited to this. The Afghanis were not invited to this. It was just decided by the Russians and by the British because they have enough power that they can kind of just dictate the terms to Persia as they wish. I hope this gives you some examples of the different types of rule, and if you have any questions, just let me know.